And off we go.
Thanks, Conte. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our call today. I just looked out my window here and we're having our first big snowstorm in Ottawa, Canada. So apologies if I got a little distracted. It was kind of beautiful for a second there. We are going to be debriefing from the recent Global Fund board meeting, which took place in Malawi, I guess 2 weeks ago. There was a lot of excitement during that board meeting, and a lot of that excitement and, in particular, some of the key discussions I'm going to leave to our colleagues from the communities and the two NGO delegations, representatives who are here on today's call to talk about. But first, I just wanted to quickly go through sort of what we were doing as GFAN at the board meeting. And so just as a reminder, GFAN has been for the last 4 or 5 years invited to participate at the board meetings as a guest of the board leadership, but I also sit in my personal capacity as a member of the developed country NGO delegation. So typically I participate in both delegation events and conversations, as well as attending the board as a guest of the board leadership. This time, it was a bit different, I would say, than previous ones, because we did try to sort of capture sort of the interest that seemed to exist in understanding the role and the involvement of civil society around and during the meeting. And as is typical, in my opinion, the best ideas come from you, our members. And so after and during our sort of pre-briefing call, there was some request for a little bit more coordination, maybe informally, around civil society and communities who were going to be at the board meeting. And so we set up a WhatsApp group. We also held an informal meeting like in Malawi ahead of the board meeting and invited Malawian colleagues, but also global community and civil society colleagues. So it's not sort of always something that we have done around board meetings. But, I think the lesson learned for us anyways is that there's possibly a role for us to support civil society and community colleagues who are attending board meetings, particularly outside of Geneva, to meet with other colleagues and to engage in understanding what the board is, what the advocacy opportunities are, etc. Because I think one of the pictures on the screen that you can see is actually Conte sort of sharing with 2 Malawian colleagues who just wanted to understand a little bit more about the board and also about replenishment. And so we were able to have a number of sort of conversations like that during that week, and is probably something that we can lean into a little bit more in the future, given that it seemed to be of interest and of use during this last board meeting. I sat on an airplane and in airports for many, many hours coming back from Malawi. And so I wrote, and we recently published, an extremely rambly set of thoughts in terms of personal sort of reflections from the long way, which I've just popped the link into there if you're interested. And just as an FYI, we, as always, have been working on sort of a more formal report that we'll review when we're not jet lagged, and get that out to you all to give you a little bit more detail about some of the key discussions and decisions. So in terms of the board meeting itself, if we can just move to the next slide, Conte. Just to quickly say what was sort of on the agenda, again, because it was outside of Geneva, it was, a board meeting that had a lot of other kind of content and a lot of other activities and opportunities for those of us who were sort of able to be there. So, for example, over the 5 days of the sort of Monday to Friday, where 3 days were formal, or 2.5, I guess, days were formal board meetings and pre-day sessions, we were able to, for example, have site visits for delegates at Global Fund supported, projects and programs, and there were many of them. And I encourage anybody who had the opportunity to go to one, to share in the chat here what they learned. But I know For me, I went to a drop-in center for female sex workers within Lilongwe, part of a network of, I think it was 24, 26 across the country. And it was really interesting to see a very comprehensive approach to services for the female sex workers, including ARTs and other long-acting treatments. And interestingly, because that site is, physically supported financially in terms of salaries and the physical location by USAID, but all of the commodities that are used in and provided to the female sex workers were funded by the Global Fund via the government. And because of that, they've actually been experiencing fewer stockouts and fewer supply issues. And so, for example, they are able to provide often up to 6 months of treatment for the clients that they serve, which is something that has, revolutionize the way that they can do their work. And, sometimes when you hear, that they screen for a number of other sort of things like TB, for example, at the drop-in center, but they don't actually have, actual diagnostics or treatment there. But they do actually have somebody who is able to take people who need referral and physically like transport them to the referral center if they wish, which is a nice sort of added way of ensuring sort of continuity of care and service. So that was kind of, the exciting parts, and also our interesting parts, being able to do that, being able to meet with civil society and community colleagues. I think all three of the delegations that we have speaking here today had sort of meetings with Malawian colleagues to understand their concerns and issues, to be able to raise them at the board meeting. But of course, the big four sort of decisions and discussions at the board meeting were around allocation, eligibility, sustainability and transition, and catalytic investments. And I am going to let our colleagues from the delegation speak to those. But just noting there that there were a number of other sort of sessions, and we will address many of them in the report that we will sort of issue. But also you can find the documentation for the board is usually a little slow to come out, but I'm popping the link in the chat to where you can find those documents as they come out. And at least when I checked yesterday, you can find the decision points from this board meeting are there, and have been, I think, since the first day. And I guess the only sort of other highlight amongst the many high-level meetings, high-level events, and other sort of conversations that involved, the Minister for the Environment and Climate in Malawi, the President of Malawi was hosted a very high-level event. But the other thing is there was a bit of a soft launch from the Global Fund team around the Stop at Nothing replenishment campaign that we've heard from them recently on calls. And so some of that has started to come out. So I think those were the key things. But one last point, if we can just go to the next slide, perhaps you saw the pictures of people that were crafting in my earlier slide. And this is just because, with big thanks to our colleagues in the communities and to NGO delegations who wore the products, were the models for the products of our Crafternoon. They wore these coats of, hashtag communities are experts to the opening session of the Global Fund Board. And it did prompt a little bit of discussion. And the idea behind this campaign for us as GFAN is to make sure that within all of the conversations and the decision making that's taking place, not just over the next year around replenishment, but in general, that community's expertise is, recognized and at the table when decisions are being made. And so we saw and really enjoyed the work that ITPC colleagues had done at the IAS in Munich at the AIDS conference this past summer. And so we kind of worked with them to kind of steal their white coats idea. And we've talked about ways in which we can work together, over the next year in particular, around bringing this communities are experts and this important sort of piece of the conversation to both the replenishment, but also to our broader advocacy in the three diseases and for, health for all, etc. So there'll be more about that coming, but again, just thanks to our models, some of whom you're going to hear from next, but thanks to our models for sharing these. And these were decorated and designed by Malawian colleagues and other civil society colleagues who were in Malawi and joined us at different events. So expect to see more of those soon. So that's it for me in terms of a bit of an introduction. And now we will get to the meat of the conversation, I think. And we're going to start with our colleagues from the developing country NGO delegation, who I think you will see have also recently sent out, I believe, a bit of a statement and a report coming out of the board meeting over the GFAN listserv. But Cecilia Sanu, who is the board member, was going to be speaking to that, but I don't see her online yet. Did I misunderstand who was going to speak from developing colleagues? Sophie?
Hi. Cecilia was supposed to be here. I'm not sure what's happened.
Okay.
I think Yolanda's on.
I was not prepared for it, but you know, we wing it out in these streets.
Yolanda, our alternate board member at the Developing Country NGO delegation, please.
And as you can see, I'm working from home, so excuse how I look.
Wonderful. Over to you.
So good morning, guys. Let me just give you a bit of an introduction very, very quickly while I just pull up this document that we have prepared for you. So I just wanted to build on two things that Katie said, and Katie did a really good introduction of what this board meeting was about. I think given the climate that we're in, it was really good to see both implementers and donors, the entire board being on the same page. And I think that's important because sometimes we can go back and forth, but the value of both donors and implementers saying, hey, we see what's at stake. We got to ramp things up. We got to make the right decision to save lives. We got to look at how we really invest more in our communities and civil society, and how do we utilize our resources to be able to protect our key and vulnerable populations. I found that was such a strong takeaway for me from this board meeting. And I also want to say that hats off to Katie and team for doing that white coat, because I think the white coat was important. One thing I have noticed at my short time at the board is that donors in particular, they listen when you speak about the value and importance of communities and CSOs. And I remember when we walked into that meeting and we all had on that white coat, it was a showstopper, but it was a showstopper in a positive way. People wanted to see the messages that were on the coats they wanted to engage in. So hats off to you guys for doing that. I'm going to share a couple of key things because I know we have perhaps developed and communities on as well. It's a very intense board meeting, but it ended up in some significant policy changes and decisions around policy changes that will drive sustainability and the direction of the Global Fund, particularly as we continue to save lives and protect our gains and maximize on our gains. All of the constituencies, donors, implementers, we recognize the significant challenges that we have. We are planning to ensure that no matter what happens in replenishment, we're well prepared to continue in sustainability. It's important to keep in mind that these decisions all go together. So every single decision that we have made is part of a holistic set of sustainability related policy decisions that were unanimously approved by the board. So I'm just going to share some of our delegation thoughts on some of the decisions. So for eligibility, what has changed? There have been minor revisions which come into effect in the GC Grant Cycle 8 cycle, intended to reinforce sustainability considerations, including greater clarity around transition and what to do if there is no World Bank gross national income that exists. How would we shift funding towards lower income countries and minor updates to multi-country eligibility requirements? So those are some of just minor changes to the eligibility. The allocation methodology from our delegation, let me just say this though, from our delegation perspective, it was very important for us to highlight, and it is something we continue to highlight on the eligibility, that the World Bank's income classification and the WHO disease metrics, they don't consider historical structural inequalities. And that is something that we continue to have a problem with. And they don't account for the challenges posed by anti-gender and anti-rights movements and the impact that this would have on civil society and communities and key and key and vulnerable populations. On allocation methodology, what has changed very quickly? Revisions were made for direct more funding towards lower income contexts at all funding levels. shift funding towards TB and malaria once basic HIV funding needs are covered at 12 billion, and ensure that the malaria burden indicator best captures each country's potential for malaria transmission. From our delegation, we wanted to highlight we wanted to highlight how challenging and divisive the discussion and decisions were around allocation methodology. And we really advocated at the board not to pit each disease against each other, because the reality is we have to protect the 3 diseases as part of our Global Fund mission. But also one thing that was raised very well was that one individual can have all 3 diseases, right? And so we need to be careful of how we approach allocation methodology. It was clear from the documentation that only if they raise 16 billion or more in the next replenishment can the Global Fund equitably address the 3 diseases and ensure progress towards achieving our SDGs. I know that some of this text is a little bit heavy and people will have questions. I'm trying to make it as layman as possible. All right. And just very quickly, my last 2 quick points. As a delegation, we have, and I think communities and developers will also talk to this, because the 3 of us continue to support and advocate for catalytic investments, because there's value to ensuring that we have catalytic investments kept and preserved. So under catalytic investments, what has changed? Every cycle, the catalytic investment priorities are proposed in response to needs and lessons learned. So the proposed grant cycle 8 catalytic investments are designed to address specific challenges, highly prioritized at different funding amounts, and designed to better leverage private sector funds where appropriate. And usually for catalytic investments over the years, we have advocated particularly for protecting multi-country grants. And in these catalytic investments, we do have multi-country grants. We do have human rights, for example. So again, we advocated that we must safeguard the catalytic investments irrespective of any funding scenario, because the catalytic investment would allow us to safeguard the critical services for key populations, especially in the context where there may be significant decreases in allocation at that country level. And very quickly, the last thing that I want to raise is sustainability, transition, and co-financing. So what changed? The revisions were designed to respond to the changing context and climate and lessons learned, to reinforce sustainability across the entire portfolio of the 3 diseases, strengthen strategic focus on co-financing, increase focus on value for money, because of course we are in a challenging climate, facilitate greater predictability for countries around transition, and how do we define transition and how do we help countries efficiently transition, emphasize alignment with country systems as well, and introduce there was some revisions of clarity and simplification in the policy document itself, which was approved. As a delegation, we also highlighted that addressing sustainability levers and the SEC policy before grant cycle 8 is essential, because we want to allow countries to prepare for what's coming ahead of them and to be able to have the dialogue at the country level to prepare for whatever changes may be made. I have a laundry list of things I could say, but I'm going to stop it there for now and allow the other delegations to jump in.
Thanks, Yolanda. I think just a quick process note as a reminder for those who haven't had the good fortune to not follow board discussions very closely, is just to note that the decisions as they were approved at the board meeting in Malawi were first presented as options to the strategy committee of the board back in October,
Yes.
along with sort of supporting documentation, et cetera. And of the ones that Yolanda was just talking about and that colleagues will talk about, there were a few important changes that were made as a result of those discussions before those sort of final decision points and options were presented to the full board. So just a quick sort of processy thing to know that, you know, it wasn't the very first time looking at those at the board, that the board and most board members and alternates had an opportunity to review it and discuss it with their delegations. Catherine.
And sorry, can I just add one thing,
Yeah.
Katie, that I think is equally important to that framing? The strategy committee, which comprises of board members across constituencies, did grapple very well with these different decisions placed before them to make the best recommendations to the board. So they did have a lot of in-depth conversation about the impact of the recommendations to the board. Okay, over and out.
Thank you, Yolanda. No, that's okay. I just thought it was a useful process, and I hope I didn't steal any of Catherine's thunder or opening points there. But Catherine, the alternate board member from the Developed Country NGO delegation, I will pass it over to you.
Thanks, Katie and Yolanda. There's no thunder here, I assure you, to steal. But want to thank Yolanda for doing the hard part, which is going first and sort of laying out all the decisions that happened. So I'm going to use the opportunity just to reinforce a few key points, and also just some positions that our delegation kind of led on a little bit or took a strong position on. So kind of going a little bit in order as well, sort of on the allocation methodology. Of course, this was a major discussion, and I liked how Yolanda put it. It was, there's a lot of unity in the room, even though this was a hard discussion and a hard decision. The sense that we needed to move forward, that we needed to do no harm to the existing work, which I think this is something we all sort of rallied behind. This didn't stop us from recognizing the fact that, TB and malaria are dramatically underfunded, and that may not be something that can be addressed necessarily in this allocation methodology, but should be considered as part of what the partnership looks at, what other donors look at. And we also really emphasize the political risks, the potential risks to key populations in particular, as well as sort of the upper middle income countries, as some of these allocation methodology decisions are combined with other policy decisions. And I'll kind of touch on that again at the end of my remarks. On the sustainability and transition and co-financing decision point, our delegation really has some genuine concerns about transition. And I think we heard that from other delegations as well, donor and implementers, as Yolanda alluded to. There's just a sense that, by moving some of the money to lower income countries, we're going to be expediting what has generally been a sort of slow moving transition process at Global Fund, with opportunity to kind of, think about it and maneuver through, exceptions and waivers. And it seems like these decisions are going to sort of force some of these transition discussions to happen faster and move faster. And so we really encouraged, any arm of the Secretariat that can help guide that discussion to do so, but in particular, really encourage the OIG's office to do an audit of what a successful transition looks like. We feel like there are examples of non-successful transition, but really, how do you do this well? And are there places we can learn if we're going to be doing this faster, if we don't have the resources? We want to make sure we're mitigating as many risks as possible and making these transition discussions, having them early, having them with communities in the ground. So, really trying to think ahead. If this is one of the sort of outcomes of all these decisions, we can take care to make sure we do as little harm as possible. We also raised the idea of a sort of a multi-country modality for both transitioned and transitioning countries, recently transitioned countries, again, to look and see, what are the outcomes, what are the unintended consequences of some of these maneuvers, and making sure we can course correct as quickly as possible when certain harms do occur. I just want to reiterate on the catalytic investments. Again, I think this was a really interesting place where there was a lot of resounding board support. Obviously, the Developed Country NGO delegation with the other civil society delegations really pressed the idea of funding the catalytic investments in any replenishment scenario. The idea being that these are really important investments that happen outside the country allocations. And if anything, they're going to be more important in a low replenishment scenario than even in a high one potentially. So that I do think we heard loud and clear from many corners of the board table. And then, just a couple of last final comments. I want to kind of tack on to what Yolanda was talking about on the importance of sort of the CCMs. And there was a joint statement issued by the three delegations on the importance of CCMs and really making sure that there are structures in place. Again, the CCMs are going to be even more critical if we're in these sort of lower replenishment scenarios, if we're in transition discussions. And so trying to really make sure that those are fully supported that there's also some structures within the secretariat as well as within the committee structures to really look at how to enhance the work they're doing and make sure that there's the right representation from communities, that they are being held to account. And I see that the statement just went up in the chat. So I'd really encourage people to take a look at that. It's something that kind of came out of discussions, particularly even with the civil society we talked with in Malawi, that the CCMs really need as much support and need to be, there needs to be more transparency and accountability across the Global Fund. And then, a couple of things, like I said, these are more themes, but we put them under the category of sort of assurances. As Yolanda alluded to, these weren't easy conversations. These weren't easy decisions, but, I think a lot of people raised the same concerns and did ask the Secretariat that, yes, we vote yes, but here are some things we need you to look at. Here are some concerns we still have. Yolanda mentioned the key and vulnerable populations. That was fairly universal around the table. There were a lot of us, our delegation, about upper middle income countries and the impacts that all these were going to have. We also reinforced the issue of digital rights and health, making sure that that is something that's also coming through as the Global Fund looks at different models and how they're sort of finding efficiencies. That's always sort of what happens first when you start to lose resources, you find efficiencies. So want to make sure that that's protected. More funding to communities, that came out loud and clear, and I'm sure the civil society delegation will touch on that. And then also just sort of exploring the portfolio optimization process as another way of moving limited resources around. Portfolio optimization has typically been used in sort of one way to plus up certain areas of funding throughout the grant cycle. And we think there may need to be opportunities to look at other ways to use portfolio optimization. And then finally, there wasn't a lot of discussion about replenishment at the board. It was sort of the final agenda item in large part, but I do think, again, around the room, there's this tension between ambition and pragmatism. And I think that the civil society delegations in particular really encouraged the Global Fund to be realistic, but not to lose that ambition. We are there to fight and end 3 diseases, and we have to still have that in mind. But we're also really eager to see how the investment case outlines what they've been hearing from donor governments, what they've been hearing from civil society on sort of what are the most important things that the Global Fund is really going to emphasize in this next grant cycle. And so that, I think, of course, is going to be really important to the work that GFAN does and all the advocates do to really hopefully push a higher replenishment amount, and some of these sort of challenges and tensions at least are minimized a bit more if we can get a higher replenishment scenario. So on that, I hope I talked slowly enough for the translator. It's not my strength, but I'll turn it back over to you, Katie.
Thanks, Catherine. Appreciate it. And I think that's a really helpful sort of way to conclude in terms of the discussions. They were challenging. They were difficult. It was interesting to witness that and to witness the intent that many people went in to both challenge some of the difficulties that could be foreseen with the decision points, but to acknowledge that, as a due diligence board, it was necessary to think about that kind of worst case scenario and how things might be, how resources would be allocated in those, but that there were positive changes as well to, as long as we can raise more funding, there are positive things that will increase the share of TB and malaria after a certain point, proportionally to HIV from the base level. There are, more supports for transition. There are a number of important catalytic investments that would take place if we reached a higher replenishment scenario. And the point that Catherine and I think Yolanda also made in terms of, reinforcing that catalytic investments are at least as, if not more important in a low scenario situation as they are in a high scenario situation. So just to say, I see that there's a couple of colleagues who have put questions in the chat, and I do want to open it up for questions at the moment, and would encourage colleagues again to either place it in the chat so that we can attempt to deal with it. If your comment or question is specifically to one of the delegations, please let us, please be specific, or to one of the speakers, but also, if possible, to use the raise hand function that typically you find under the React button if you're working from a latest version. But I don't believe that our colleagues from communities have been able to join us today, or at least I'm not seeing any of the leadership online. So for now, I think that we will go ahead with sort of Q&A. And if they are able to join us later, we'll give them the floor to make sure that they share some of their important points and takeaways from the board meeting. So any questions, noting for Catherine and Yolanda that there is a question, Catherine, from Alana about clarifying your point about multi-country modalities. And I think for both of you, yes, so so for the decision points, I'm not sure what colleagues can share specifically today, but the annexes and the reports and all the rest of it still to come. So while the decision points reference reports, they do exist. They were discussed and looked at by the board, by the delegations and the constituencies, but they just haven't published the 35 documents and reports that would include, for example, that annex, Lindsay. So Catherine, I'll pass it over to you first in terms of perhaps addressing that question about the multi-country modalities, and then I'll go back to you, Yolanda, if there's anything to, oh, you already answered it in the chat.
Well,
See,
I answered it, but I just want to be,
and I can't keep up.
okay. And also, I just want to be clear. It was, we didn't make like a formal call. This was an idea that we want them to think about as kind of a full package of this idea of transitioning. Like I said, that there's a lot of potential push in that area, but not a lot of support for it, right? And we want to make sure that they're looking at a lot of different options. So this is one thing we think that could help. Again, so we're not just kicking people out, because one of the things in the eligibility, correct me if I'm wrong, or STC, and I'm going to get them confused, is, this idea that once you've transitioned, right? They're really trying to stop this whole, you transition, then you kind of requalify, then you transition out again. And so this is just an area that we really want them to look at. And, again, the fate of the multi-country grants is a little up in the air also with the reduced, if there are reduced resources. So it's kind of an area of exploration. But just, there are also people in my delegation who help craft that recommendation. I don't want to, they probably could describe it better than I can, but I see you're off mute, Yolanda, so I'll let you chime in.
No, I just wanted to chime in on multi-country, because the value of the multi-country is that when countries, because a multi-country gives you money to different smaller countries that wouldn't get a grant, right? So when a country may be transitioning, a multi-country grant will still be allowed to help you fund the gap. And most times the gap is the response to key and vulnerable populations. And so the value of the multi-country grant is to help us fill those gaps as other countries transition, right? I don't know if I'm explaining this coherently for you to understand. So if I'm not, let me know. But I think also it was something that both developed and developed to put on the table, and we're also supporting, because we have always advocated as a delegation for investing in multi-country grants. We have seen how those multi-country grants, particularly in LAC, Latin America and the Caribbean, and also in ICA, how those multi-country grants really help continue providing services to key and vulnerable populations. Alana, I see you talking about adding it to the next committee meetings. I hope so, because as Catherine said, there were a lot of things while we accepted and approved the decisions as they are, because we have to move forward. We did indicate some of the clear things that the Secretariat needs to go back to and discuss. Lindsay, I don't know how to answer your question right now, and I don't know if I can. I think we can come back to it in the next round once the papers have been posted and the annexes have been posted. I don't want to preempt any conversation on that until I see what has been posted coming out of the board meeting. Sorry about that.
No, I think I just opened the decision points, Yolanda, to see, and I can see how there isn't actually a lot of clarity in the decision points about what the decisions actually were, because they all kind of refer back to documents and annexes and that. So the decision points on their own are not a particularly useful documentation, but I would just note that the developing country statement, there's a little bit more detail there in terms of some of the decisions, and we'd have a bit more detail in our report as well. Typically, I think it usually takes about 3 weeks for the Global Fund to finalize, like to make sure that they've got the finalized, completely, spell checked and so on, papers, but and put them up, but it's just not a timeline we control. And it does feel like it takes a bit longer now than it used to get those documents up there. There's a comment from Asia. There's nothing in the decisions that require CI to be funded regardless of any replenishment
So the
outcome.
documents that were provided to us give us clear indications of the CIs that will be provided across potential replenishment outcomes. One of the key things that we highlighted as a board is that we need to ensure that no matter which one we get, the catalytic investments are preserved. That it's not a gamble, that we're not up for discussion, that the catalytic investments are preserved. And believe me, from our end, we're pushing, and we'll be monitoring that because it's a big, at which level? Well, the catalytic investments were provided across different funding scenarios. So we had, remind me, colleagues, we had 12 and above, we had 16 and above, we had, I don't remember. What was not provided in clear, precise terms is what would happen if we got below 12 billion. And that was one of the recommendations that we said, no matter what, let us plan and know we're not accepting a below 12 billion replenishment. Let me be very clear. And we're not saying that we're getting that. What we are saying is let us plan across any potential funding scenario for where the CIs will cross, including a lower funding scenario. I just want to make that crystal clear. I see your hand, Asia, so you can go ahead. I was just trying to answer what you had in
No,
mind.
I appreciate it. I think I'm being confusing. I'm sorry for that. So just to clarify, that's exactly what I'm referring to. Not the scenarios that were put, because last time the 7th replenishment, the catalytic investments were cut, particularly planned for community interventions.
Yeah.
So I'm just seeking clarity about whether there's still this blind spot in the decision points, because my understanding is that could happen again. However, so that's one question. Could it happen again? And what do we do to prevent that? In the scenario of a suboptimal replenishment, how do we create a guardrail? And then second, even for the 3 scenarios put forward, are community investments protected at the same level regardless? And is that part of the decision, or will there be shenanigans subtracting next time around as well? Thanks.
Whew. Catherine, you tag teaming me here on this? Girl.
I'm now going to my memory and trying to look up notes. I mean, I would not, it's hard to characterize a discussion, right? So I do feel as though the way it was presented and the way the discussion in the room went is that there would be funding for CIs in any replenishment scenario unless it was catastrophic, right? So to the point is we did not get numbers laid out per category under 12, because I do think 12 is really the sort of, bare minimum they're trying to lay out right now. So yeah, but there was a heavy discussion and heavy notation about if that were to emerge, that discussion would happen very quickly within the strategy committee be presented to the board. As to the specifics on the communities, that's a little trickier, mostly because there has been some condensing of categories of CIs from last time. So those of you remember the catalytic investments last time, there was quite a number of them and they were quite diverse in nature. This time they have really tried to bucket them a little bit more to allow for numbers to align a little differently. And so anyway, you do sort of see the build community networks engagement. You do see agenda, and these were kind of considered, thank you for pulling this up, essential. There are ones here that you don't get money from the jump. You see the zeros on that first column. So I don't know how to answer like a worst case scenario, because we are trying to, that discussion is going to happen at a different time, but I do think you can see what is being prioritized. And again, these numbers changed during the committee process to make sure there was funding available for human rights, for community networks, you know, for some of these things at earlier levels. So I feel like there's a pretty good signal. The numbers aren't high though, and that's a different part of the problem. So money is there, money's available early, but is the amount of money going to be meaningful? I don't think that's really been teed up yet, frankly.
So just to add to what Catherine is saying and to make it clear, we did decide, and I think it was in the document or decision point or something, I don't remember. We did decide as a board that no matter the funding scenario, no matter whether it is low, medium, high, extra high, no matter the funding scenario, catalytic investments are critical investments that we need to ensure we have funds for, right? For the GC8 allocation, how much that would be and under which category in a low funding scenario, that has to come back to the strategy committee when we see what the replenishment outtake will be. And if you look on the table that's on the screen, we know everything from 12 and above, right? But 12 and below is where we would have to come back to the strategy committee, who would make recommendations and bring it to the board for us to decide how, if we get a low funding scenario, how would those catalytic investments be allocated? And I just want to reiterate that at the board, there was significant support for ensuring that we protect our catalytic investments, for ensuring that we protect our key and vulnerable populations, and for ensuring that we look at how do we build the capacity of CSOs and communities to continue the work as we talk about this entire sustainability package. I think that's the best response we can give you right now on it. Nothing else we can share because we don't know. Again, all of these things we will only know the path forward when we know what the replenishment outcome is. Right now, we don't know how much we're going to get, right? We don't know. But we're advocating hard to get the best and most successful replenishment. I hope that helps.
Thank you both. Just noting for everybody, just because I have shared this, I don't want anybody to like copy this and 100% believe that I have the most recent version of the paper, because there were a few, but I do believe that this one captures the two sort of most significant changes that came out of the committee and were recommended to the board and adopted, which included that first column at the 12.26 billion level, what increased between what was originally proposed from 200 to 260 million, which is a little bit more in line with, I guess, just the prioritization that board members and delegations felt was useful, and that there would still be funds for catalytic investments if it was less than 12.26 available in sources of funds, but that in that case, the Secretariat would come with a new recommendation. So there's definitely opportunity if there is that crisis of that amount, that low amount of funding, there's definitely opportunity and a need to be ready to advocate for, you know, the catalytic investments that are critical in our perspectives as, you know, community, civil society, NGO organizations. So I'm seeing a lot more happening in the chat here, including Vitaly attempting to answer Mike's question. And then I see a question from Solveig and from Chao Sok about sort of the disease splits. And so, yes, there was absolutely a decision on the disease splits. I'm going to stop sharing this and pass it over to our colleagues from the delegations if they want to take that on, and see if I can find one of the documents where that is a little bit clearer to screen share that for you all. Is that okay, Yolanda or Catherine, to sort of address, you know, more specifically what the disease split decisions were?
I will try. I'm pulling up. This is where I don't want to be inaccurate. I'm going to try to pull up something as best as I can.
Yeah, same.
But the answer is yes. There was a disease split decision. It's so complicated to say out loud though. Again, Yolanda, jump in and correct me when I get this wrong. But basically the decision was to set a target of a global disease split that would have 40% of funding to HIV, 25% of funding to TB, and 35% for malaria programs. However, the goal of that split is not reached until you get to 17 billion or 16 billion. Now I'm
16
looking
billion.
at 16 billion, right? So basically we start with the more traditional splits at the beginning and at 12.26. Over time, the percentages shift. That's why I said it's very hard to talk about without like a graph in front of you. So, you know, you will start off with the more traditional 45, Yolanda, count me, 18, 20, 30, okay, whatever. The numbers are there. You start off with sort of the traditional split. Again, this is this do no harm principle that under the initial D split, we're going to kind of stay where we are. But as the amount of replenishment increases, the money begins to shift away from HIV and more towards TB and malaria. So that's a terrible way to articulate that verbally. But there's a graph somewhere I'm sure we can find to put up later, or it'll be in one of the documents that gets posted soon. Sorry, Yolanda, I want to help out here.
No, that's what it is. You're very good at finding the documents. I can't even find mine at the moment, but that's where the split is at the moment. Again, pending replenishment, pending the replenishment outcome. I think also I saw a conversation earlier in the chat. I don't remember who put it in there about protesting against the 3 diseases. And look, I will tell you exactly what we said at the board. This is not easy, all right? Because when we go up and the money for the replenishment increases, money is moved away from one disease, which would be HIV. And we don't know how that would work because there would be some spaces where we would have gaps in our HIV response, right? We don't know. So trying to pit each disease against each other right now is not going to work. And I think we don't have the ideal GDS split across any of the diseases to fund what we have. But I think also we need to be able to work with the split that we have at the moment, advocate for the best replenishment, and then take it from there. The best we can do is tell you what has been decided on the contingency and understanding that when that replenishment comes in the pot, we may have to go back to the drawing board and have further discussions about what we have in principle decided across the policies.
Sorry, everybody, if you heard my scream there, it wasn't up. I swear the internet hates me. I was just about to pull up the document and I will get it again on the disease split, but I see Mike has his hand raised and he's asking all kinds of detailed questions in the chat. So Mike, I'll pass it over to you for your question while I try again to pull that document up around the disease split so that the numbers are clear for colleagues leaving this call, and when the reports are available, you'll have them. Mike.
Oh, apologies, I didn't mean to leave my hand up, but yeah, just sort of coming back to, and thanks Vitali for sort of covering my question just around sustainability. I think, yeah, it's important that we keep track on that, particularly, you know, the sort of the shift and what it will mean for, you know, middle and upper middle income countries and key populations and communities in those countries. And then just, yeah, I guess this is probably a really hard question to answer, but just from sort of across the eligibility and allocation, you know, policies, just a sense of, you know, whether there was sort of positive progression for like the recognition and the commitment to funding for civil society and communities, and particularly key populations. Yeah, just whether you and the delegations have a sense of that. And you'll see, I did just put in a point in the chat just around the catalytic funding, and it's interesting to note that it was there was a commitment to 900 million. I think it was in 2019. for the highest sort of replenishment amount. And yeah, interested if there was any discussion of that, or whether the Secretariat just, I mean, often the discussion was, well, you know, this balance between money for grants and catalytic funding. And so, but just wondered if that was mentioned at all and there was discussion there. Thanks.
I'll kick off, Yolanda, and then let you jump in. Thanks for that point, Mike. I think there was a lot of, I don't want to call it discussion, recognition would be better, that there is this, there are some split views on the how important CIs are. I don't think the importance is there, but like when you get it, if it's taking money out of country envelopes and allocations, where's the right balance there? And so I think there was some sort of recognition. Again, I think the recognition at the table really went to sort of protecting the CIs and making sure they were invested early. I don't think there was as much emphasis, as you point out, on them being funded later. Like this, you see in the document up right now, that, really what's interesting is that they say the full CI amount is 800 million at 5.2. So again, this idea that they want to kind of put CIs at the front of the line. But as if we were to get to a 17 billion, more of that money is going into country allocation. So I do think there's still a little bit of a balance of not necessarily as much around the amount, but like, is it a front loaded investment, or is it an investment that kind of goes on pace with replenishment? I think you'll see here there's an idea of kind of keeping it towards the front of the line because of the importance that they have. Just on the transition sustainability, just want to echo that. It's hard with these decisions because it's not one single decision has the impact that we're worried about. It's how they apply against each other. And I think Vitaly actually said something really nicely in the meetings, is that it almost feels like there's a hostility in some ways. And if you applied each one of these policies in their kind of most strictest, then you really are starting to strangle some of the funding around UMCs. You are sort of compromising some of the key populations work in those countries. And so it's really more of an alarm bell that we're sounding versus any one policy being right or wrong, but the application thereof is what we're really trying to keep an eye on. I feel like I've forgotten something else you asked. I'm hoping Yolanda remembers it. But over.
No, I think you captured it well, Catherine. I don't have anything else to add to that.
I remember now. It was the communities thing. Yolanda herself spoke very loud and proud, often, and with her serious tone, about the need to really be less, I'm going to use my words, like, we're willing to put everything on the table except how we fund communities. And I feel like there was a little bit of a, again, everyone says key populations, human rights, all the stuff they want to accomplish and work on, but less about how they want to work on it. And I think, the developing country NGO delegation, Yolanda and Cecilia in particular, really kept pushing, like, if we're looking at everything, we should look at this too and figure out how to better fund that stuff directly. So the point was made. I don't think there's anything in the decision points that goes one way or the other on that. But like I said, the recognition of the importance of communities, the need to put human rights and communities in CIs was really high. But how that money gets into country was not really on the agenda this time. But I don't want to speak for you, Yolanda. That was really something you and Cecilia spoke eloquently on.
No, Catherine, you're very right. And actually, that is what I wanted to add to the conversation. And it is something particularly from developing that we're not going to let go of. Okay, it's not an advocacy point we're going to let go of. We're at that stage in the game where we have to think about how we do funding and funding models to ensure that communities and CSOs are getting direct funding to be able to be collaborative partners on the ground in addressing the 3 diseases. And that is something that we made very clear at the board. We made very clear to the secretary that, hey, you guys need to think about this while you go back to the drawing board, and we're expecting to get a follow-up on it. Come to us as a board and tell us, well, what are some of the suggestions you have to make this happen? What are the challenges that you're facing in making this happen? What are some of the policy decisions that the board would need to make in order to make this happen? And I think also there's a recognition at the board now, more than I've seen it before in my time at the board, that, okay, yeah, we can't do business as usual. We have to look at funding for CSOs and communities. So Cecilia and I, on behalf of developing, we made that very clear at the board, and it is something we are going to follow up on as we go through And it was also supported by developed communities. And I know that as 3 communities and civil society organizations, we're going, delegations, sorry, we're going to push hard and follow up on this. And the last point that Catherine made about the catalytic investments, was it catalytic, you said, Kat? Human rights being included in there,
Yep.
thing like that. Right, that was something that we also keep advocating for. I do know that in the 12 and above scenarios, we do have a line in there for human rights, but it's also something we're advocating very hard on, because we recognize that if we don't deal adequately with the human rights challenges, we're not going to make the progress we need across the 3 diseases.
Thank you both. I think that's attempting to kind of wrap up many of the questions that have come in. A suggestion from Mike there in the chat around whether or not there's some collective sort of interest in looking at what the impact of the policies could be, how that would impact communities, key populations, human rights, et cetera. And, the intersection with, what I still see as a really challenging, if technically correct, analysis from the PCSA that was released this summer around civil society and community funding, which suggested a very large amount of direct funding to CSOs and communities that I think doesn't reflect the lived reality of many people in the Global Fund community, because we're talking about sort of slightly different things when we talk about civil society and community funding sometimes than what other people are talking about. And yes, Mike, I think there is interest in that. And so it is something that we should, sort of talk about in terms of how we develop that information, develop that knowledge. But I think Alana and some other colleagues in particular have been doing some further analysis, Mike, that might be of interest to you in that area. I think the challenge, for us as GFAN to sort of follow up from our initial kind of, here's the choices and the paths we have in front of us, depending on, sort of replenishment, is as we see the investment case and we see these decisions, there is a way to do some extrapolation in terms of what the impact would be of, various replenishment scenarios. But they're fairly complicated, right? And the time will be tight. And so we'll have to assess sort of how much of that is helpful and useful, depending on what's actually done for us in the investment case. And just to say, I don't have any further clarity about when the preparatory meeting would be, but we hear rumors that there are plans afoot for sort of middle to end of February. So I just share that. I do not have any other information, but just share that with everybody, because typically the preparatory meeting is an opportunity to, again, sort of solidify our asks as a collective, but also do some of that analysis once we have the investment case, to present some other ways to look at the impact of decisions, but also the impact of low replenishment scenarios, so that we can effectively advocate for higher ones. There's maybe a few questions here that have not, we've not been able to answer. And for that, I apologize. But as always, while this is our last call of the year as GFAN, this is not the last call before we get to replenishment, and we'll be kicking off and sharing information about our first call in January in the next week or so. Yolanda, I think you wanted to, Conte had done a very nice slide where he cut out the in 2 weeks to next year. But Yolanda, your hand was raised, so I just wanted to pass to you if there was one other thing that you wanted to add before we close today.
First to begin, I just want to thank each of you for always being so engaged and sharing with us information, wishing you a very happy Christmas and New Year, but also reminding us that it is each of our responsibilities to contribute to and to advocate for and to use GFAN as one network to get the most successful replenishment. At the end of the day, at the end of that board meeting, that was the biggest takeaway, that we have to all work together, speak to our technical partners, our countries, our donors, everybody, and talk about how do we get the best replenishment ever. Over and out.
Well, thank you, Yolanda. I'm not sure I could have closed the call any better. So thank you for that. Thank you all for your, collaborations this year, and looking forward to seeing many of you in the new year, online and in person. Just wishing you, from our team to you and yours, a very happy Christmas, happy Festivus, happy Hanukkah if you celebrate, and good holidays and end of year, and a good start to 2025. And we'll be seeing you all then and doing lots of work again together next year. So thank you all. Have a good rest of your days and take good care. Bye.